I want to point out a few things. One thing is that the whole notion that you have a resolution to protect civilians by calling in NATO is absurd. NATO is not equipped to protect civilians. NATO is predicted to bomb them, to send cruise missiles. What NATO does and the United States does what it's equipped to do, and it is not equipped to protect civilians. If the United Nations had wanted to protect civilians, they would have sent in a neutral observation team that could have been done very rapidly from different neutral nations to find out what was really going on the ground. Because in fact, we don't know what is really going on the ground. There have been reports of atrocities. If there were proof and photos of those atrocities committed by the Gaddafi regime, I think we'd be seeing them every hour on the Western television screens. We're not seeing them, and so I am not sure that that is really the case. Of course, now there will be atrocities, and now there will be deaths because NATO is involved, and that always brings about atrocities.
Well, stop bombing Libya!
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 U.S. hands off!
U.S. hands off!
UN hands off!
UN hands off!
Canada hands off!
Canada hands off!
NATO hands off!
NATO hands off!
Hands off Libya!
Hands off Libya!
The rebellion in Libya, unlike the demonstrations in Egypt and in Tunisia, was armed practically from the start. So you have an armed rebellion. Naturally, you tell me what country, when it has an armed rebellion, doesn't try to repress it. And immediately the repression is denounced as violation of human rights or even genocide, and that's the excuse for the United States and NATO to intervene. They have their own motives for that, but they will use that, and they can do it anywhere. They can do it anywhere. You see, this is a very dangerous precedent because it can be used against any country whose regime the United States and its allies don't like. And then the real objective is regime change.
In Iraq, people are having demonstrations against an intervention in Libya because they know that this is a very big step that the imperialists are taking against poor and oppressed people and people in third world countries around the world. And so us here too, although we stand and we continue with the demands of an end to war on Iraq and Canada, US, NATO out of Afghanistan.
Doing the campaigns are very well versed in the lessons. They know, for example, based on the experience of Kosovo, not to allow ceasefire monitors in because they can tell you who's breaking the ceasefire. Now, in the case of Libya, the Libyan foreign minister accepted the resolution as it was passed the other day and said that he demanded observers to monitor the ceasefire straight away. Why wasn't that invitation taken up? Because if we want a genuine dialogue, as the resolution called for, if we want peace and an end to violence, then we need a ceasefire, we need dialogue between the parties. Bear in mind that in Western countries, it takes 5 years to enable regime change, and it's the outcome of a long process of dialogue. Over in Libya and the Middle East, it seems that the expectation is to create regime change in 5 days and to do it at the point of a Tomahawk cruise missile.
They're trying to put smoke in front of our eyes to hide what they are doing in the Middle East, what they've been doing in North Africa for decades. That those people in the streets are really against the US and Canadian empire. They're against the imperialism that is suppressing them for their whole lives. So they talk about Libya, and they focus on the countries to take away what people are thinking about their role in the whole region. The U.S., no Western imperialist power, has any right to be on Libyan soil and to enforce no-fly zones and to create war on the Libyan people. The Libyan people have every right to change their country without a foreign military intervention, and they are completely capable. Just as the people in Egypt Just as the people in Tunisia were able to do that without the United States military, without the Canadian military. And it's our duty here, living within Canada, who's part of the war on people in Libya, to show on the streets that we are against this war drive, that we don't support the bombing of a people. We are in support of their self-determination for them to change their country themselves, just as we are for any third world country in the world who's facing the same exploitation and domination. So once again, can we get our voices loud and clear, demanding, hands off Libya!
Hands off Libya!
Stop bombing Libya!
Stop bombing Libya!
Thank you.
If people cared about peace, but I don't think that's what they cared about, and we can get into that, is what's really behind this, they would have, the United Nations has now completely disgraced itself, to my mind, because it is supposed to be a peacekeeping operation, and it should, to keep peace, you first of all have to know the facts. They had to send in neutral observers. They have refused to do that. Instead of that, they send in NATO, which cannot possibly protect civilian lives. It's naive to think that. I mean, a lot of people have fallen for that. I think it's by pure ignorance, by some and by calculation of another. But a no-fly zone, you see, already they've gone beyond that. They always go beyond whatever excuse they give to get to start military.
The U.S.-NATO intervention against Libya. The intervention is being carried out by a coalition of colonialist and imperialist powers. The reasons given to protect civilians, promote democracy and human rights, etc., are nothing but propaganda. The U.S. has installed and propped up many of the most reactionary regimes in the world, and nowhere more than in the Middle East. Washington considers the most reliable client states in the Arab world to be the absolute and hereditary monarchies, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, Qatar, the UAE, Jordan, Morocco, and Oman. How can anyone believe that U.S. policy supports democracy and human rights when at the same time it provides all kinds of weaponry to these monarchies to crush their own people? The same was true for 3 decades in Egypt, where the U.S. gave tens of billions of weapons to the Mubarak regime to use against the Egyptian people. It was only when it became clear that the power of the people's movement was too strong and that Mubarak had become a liability that the Obama administration suddenly became concerned about democracy in Egypt. While the U.S. leaders have used the UN Security Council to impose sanctions, a no-fly zone, and to try to justify their new war against Libya, they have done absolutely nothing against the government of Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen, whose security forces killed 52 protesters and wounded more than 200 others this last Friday. Not only are there no sanctions against Yemen, U.S. military aid to use against the people continues to flow into that country. Why the difference? The answer is that the U.S. leaders want to bring about regime change in Libya, the country with the largest oil reserves in all of Africa, and turn Libya into a client state, while they want to prevent regime change in Yemen, where Saleh has been a useful client and agent of U.S. policy in the region. The protests in Libya quickly turned into a civil war. There was a split in the government, military, and security forces, and an armed struggle began. At first, the opposition had the momentum and made big gains, taking over the eastern part of the country where most of the oil production is located. As the struggle continued, the pro-Gaddafi forces went on the offensive and appeared on the verge of defeating the opposition. That prospect caused the U.S., Britain, and France to decide to launch airstrikes on March 19th, the 8th anniversary of the attack on Iraq, to try to turn the tide and rescue the opposition. The opposition, which had been pleading for imperialist intervention, is now fervently pro-U.S. and NATO. Our position is to oppose any imperialist intervention. The Libyan people must decide the future of Libya. Thank you.
So again, that's James Hutter from Answer Seattle, and they are right now rallying just as we are in Seattle, in downtown Seattle, along with many other groups across the United States and around the world.
half the population, as I see it, on his side, Libya really does look like becoming a new Iraq. I presume we'll be seeing depleted uranium missiles thrown by the benevolent humanitarian Western aircraft onto that population there. We should remember that the resolution calls for dialogue, i.e. it requires two sides both to be around in order to engage in that dialogue. So it shouldn't be about getting rid of Colonel Gaddafi. If it is, then this action on day one is already in breach of international law because it's in breach of the resolution by which action was enforced. We needed dialogue, we needed ceasefire, we've got bombs instead. The bombs are not necessary for the peace. What we need is a ceasefire for the peace, and that really should be the aim of the mission. To the extent that it is not the aim of the mission has now become compromised and should be stopped as soon as possible.
We in Canada are mobilized by U.S. imperialism to be their flunkies and their lackeys in support of every war of aggression against the world's people on behalf of U.S. imperialism and the Canadian financial oligarchy, which itself profits from the sellout of Canada and from the conquest and annexation of weaker and smaller countries around the world. They are utter traitors to the people of Canada, to the Indigenous peoples, to the Quebec nation, to all the working class people of Canada, because they use the Canadian state not only to exploit and oppress the people of Canada, but to exploit and oppress peoples around the world. And we say, down with the Canadian state, down with the bombing of Libya, and down with their war preparations in NATO and in their occupation of Afghanistan and so on.
I would say that such interventions are never justified because they represent a huge investment on the part of those intervening, and they only justify themselves in terms of their ability to achieve the aims of the interveners, which are always strategic, designed to position themselves into occupation positions in strategically vital areas of the world. So in terms of how they benefit the local population, the answer is not at all. In fact, they're always very negative. Afghanistan in 1979, the intervention then has led to 30 years and still ongoing instability. Kosovo in 1999, still a fake state of desperate poverty and desperate crime in all that entire area. Bosnia was an opportunity for peace and diplomacy. They didn't take it, and a war ensued there as well. Iraq, we know, another nightmare. We have, and now we're building up to a new Iraq in Libya. Basically, these interventions have never led to successful conclusions. They lead to open-ended Western occupations and regional instability on a continuing basis designed to justify those occupations. That's what they're about.
Canadian forces and the United States continue to occupy Afghanistan, and that around the world, imperialism is going into countries not only for resources, but also for political benefit, for military strategy, and never to help the people of that country. Never because they believe in humanity or because they believe in building a better and just world, as they say. Because if they believed in those things, they would not be rising tuition fees here at home. There would not be problems of homelessness in the downtown east side. If they believed in Canada and they believed in creating a better world, they would be solving the crimes that have been committed against Indigenous women who have been killed, murdered, and gone missing across Canada. If our government believed in humanity and believed in creating a better world, they would invest more in building a better world here in Canada, in making Canada a more equal place for all people. And they are not. Instead, they go to other countries under the banner of justice and bomb people, disrupt their daily lives, their access to food, their access to water. And we are here today to condemn, especially the bombing of Libya, and to say no, war on Libya!
No war on Libya!
No war on Libya!
No war on Libya!
And while we are very ashamed of the government of Canada, not only Harper's Conservatives, but also the Liberal Party and the NDP, who have refused to speak out against